In 1942, during the height of World War II, one of the many concentration camps was established in Eastern Europe. This particular camp was unique. Its scale was immense, and the living conditions were almost unimaginable. There was no place for the weak here, and only the strongest and most determined could survive. However, even they were not always able to withstand the hunger that became their constant companion. Among all the horrors of the camp, the most terrifying was starvation. The rations were meager, and the portions were so small that each prisoner began thinking about how to find food just to survive another day. Hunger wasn't just a physical pain, it was a psychological torture. People lost strength, their bodies were wasting away, and their minds began to dull from the constant need. Among the prisoners was a woman whose name is rarely remembered in history. Her name was Mariana. She was one of those who were sent to the camp as an undesirable person because of her ethnic background, her political views, or her active participation in the resistance. All that was known about her was that she was the wife of a soldier who had been captured, and thus, her life from the start was doomed to harsh trials. Mariana wasn't the only woman in the camp, but she was different from most other prisoners in her resilience and remarkable resourcefulness. The camp was no place for the weak. Those who couldn't work, who couldn't gather any food or materials to survive, couldn't expect a long life. Mariana, however, realized from the very beginning that in order to survive, one had to be prepared for any fight. One day, in the midst of winter, the situation in the camp became particularly dire. Food supplies were rapidly dwindling, and the camp authorities saw no reason to increase the rations. By then, the prisoners had long forgotten the taste of normal food. Mariana watched as people lost hope, as they began to give in to despair. And then, strangely enough, it was she who thought that salvation wasn't only in bravery, but in the ability to survive under any circumstance. Watching the daily life in the camp, she noticed that many prisoners, despite their physical and mental decline, continued to collect any found materials: rotten wood, scraps of fabric, old metal objects. All of this was discarded, but each of these items could be part of something bigger. Mariana, in essence, became not just a survivor, but someone who could see potential even in the most useless things. Mariana began to gradually gather the scraps of food that other prisoners set aside in the hope of better times. Instead of eating it herself, she collected everything together to create something more. In her eyes, there was a glimmer of hope, despite everything happening around her. Her actions started to attract attention, and soon people began to seek her help. But no one yet knew that Mariana would be the one to become the hope for hundreds of others. Surviving in the camp was long and brutal, but for Mariana, it was a kind of endurance training, a test of her spirit and her ability to survive. She started to see the world differently. Everything that had no obvious value to others, she saw as a key to survival. Soon, Mariana decided to use all her strength and knowledge to help others. In 1942, no one expected that a woman in a concentration camp would be the one to save hundreds of lives. But it was her courage, ingenuity, and willingness to fight that would turn out to be the factors capable of changing everything. Hunger, cold, and weakness were on the verge of breaking the last of their strength. But Mariana turned out to be the person who found a way to push through it all. This was only the beginning of her fight. The days grew colder and longer as winter tightened its grip on the camp. The prisoners' bodies weakened from a combination of hunger and the relentless cold, and yet the camp authorities continued to provide minimal rations. The food situation had become increasingly desperate. The prisoners were not only fighting to stay warm, but also struggling against the ever-present gnawing of hunger that seemed to consume every moment of their waking lives. Despite the brutality of their circumstances, the prisoners had found a way to endure, or so they thought. Mariana, however, knew that simply enduring would not be enough. She could see the desperation in the eyes of her fellow prisoners, the hopelessness creeping into their hearts. As the days went by, it became clear that if something wasn't done, the situation would only continue to deteriorate. Mariana realized that the food supply could not be relied upon to improve, and the camp's authorities would not act out of kindness. She began to think about how she could alter the course of their fate. She started by gathering the scraps of food that others had discarded or saved for later. Bits of bread, dried up vegetables, and even the smallest crumbs could be salvaged and put to use. While other prisoners ate what they could, Mariana, instead of indulging herself, carefully stored everything she could find. She began to develop a plan, and though it was ambitious, she believed it was their only hope. She started working in secret, avoiding the eyes of the guards and her fellow prisoners. In the dark corners of the camp, she began to combine the scraps, using whatever tools she could find to break down the food into smaller parts. It was a slow process. She could only work in small increments, but over time, she began to accumulate enough material to create something that could sustain a larger group. Her plan was simple, yet it required every bit of ingenuity she had. Mariana knew that making a nourishing meal from the scraps was impossible on its own, but she also knew that food wasn't the only thing they needed. If they could find a way to make the smallest amounts last longer, to stretch what they had, it could make the difference between life and death. The key was to use every available resource to create something that could provide sustenance and, most importantly, give the prisoners the strength to keep going. Mariana had observed the other prisoners. Some were skilled with metal, while others knew how to weave or sew. She could see that each of them had something to offer, but what was needed was coordination. The camp had no formal kitchens or facilities to prepare food, and the conditions were far from ideal for creating anything that resembled a proper meal. Yet, Mariana began to experiment. She knew that the prisoners who worked with metal could make small cooking devices. Those who could sew could craft bags to hold the food. Some had knowledge of herbs and plants that grew around the camp. These could be used to add flavor and nutrition to the mixture she was preparing. Mariana spoke to a few trusted individuals, explaining her vision. She kept her plan vague at first, as the consequences of being caught could be severe. However, she carefully selected a small group of prisoners who were resourceful and determined. Over the next few weeks, Mariana's plan began to take shape. The metal workers created small cooking pots from scrap materials. The seamstresses began to sew fabric bags to hold the dried food. The herbalists gathered any plants they could find in the nearby woods. Together, they began to work quietly, and slowly, the prisoners started to see something change in their daily lives. The key to Mariana's plan was resourcefulness. She didn't rely on traditional methods of cooking or food preparation. Instead, she used the knowledge and skills of the people around her to create an alternative system of survival. In the darkest corners of the camp, she and her group began to prepare food that could be distributed to the prisoners. It wasn't much, but it was something. Each small meal could feed several people, and over time, they were able to stretch the food supply further than anyone could have imagined. The change in the camp was subtle at first. Prisoners began to regain some of their strength. They could work longer hours, and their minds seemed sharper. The smallest portions of food seemed to last longer. But more than anything, hope began to return. Mariana had sparked something within the camp. People who had given up were now starting to believe that survival was possible. Still, Mariana knew that the danger was ever present. The camp authorities could discover their activities at any time, and if that happened, the consequences would be severe. She continued to work in secret, moving quietly between the groups, keeping her plan under wraps. But with each passing day, the prisoners grew stronger. They had a sense of purpose now, something they hadn't felt in a long time. They were no longer just existing. They were fighting to survive. Mariana's ingenuity had made a difference. The small acts of rebellion, the quiet acts of defiance, were beginning to add up. With every piece of food she managed to salvage, with every small meal that was distributed, she was proving that survival was possible, even in the most dire of circumstances. And slowly, she was earning the trust of the others. They began to see her not just as a fellow prisoner, but as a leader, someone who had the strength to guide them through the darkness. As the camp endured another harsh winter, the prisoners found themselves united in a way they hadn't been before. They had Mariana's ingenuity to thank for that. She had given them more than food. She had given them a reason to hope again. The weeks passed by, and with each day, the situation in the camp grew more precarious. Mariana's plan was working, but it was far from perfect. As the small network of prisoners she had organized quietly continued to gather materials and prepare food, the risks they took became ever more apparent. Every time they gathered scraps or worked with the metal, they did so under the constant threat of discovery. The guards grew more suspicious as the prisoners began to regain their strength, and rumors of unusual activities started circulating within the camp. Though the food was not plentiful, it was enough to keep the prisoners going, and more importantly, it gave them hope. In a place where hope had long been absent, it was the most precious thing they could cling to. But as the prisoners grew stronger, their capacity for resistance grew as well. They no longer saw themselves simply as victims of the system. They began to see themselves as fighters. For the first time in months, they felt like they had control over their destiny, even if that control was only in small actions and quiet defiance. Mariana, however, knew that every victory came with a cost. The authorities would eventually notice the changes in the camp. The more the prisoners ate, the more energy they had. Their spirits were lifting, and that was a dangerous sign. The camp guards were trained to recognize even the smallest signs of rebellion, and the slightest deviation from the norm could lead to a brutal crackdown. Mariana also knew that she was taking the greatest risk of all. If she were caught, she would not only face punishment for her actions, but could be held responsible for the actions of every prisoner she had helped. The stakes were higher than ever. Despite these risks, Mariana pushed forward. She couldn't stop now. The prisoners who had once been little more than shadows of their former selves were slowly coming back to life, and they were beginning to depend on her. She had become their symbol of hope, their quiet leader in a place where leaders were typically silenced. She worked tirelessly, moving from one group to the next, coordinating efforts and encouraging the prisoners to keep going. Every day, they grew more determined, and with each passing week, Mariana's plan began to take a more solid shape. One of the most difficult challenges was finding enough food for the growing group. The small meals they were able to prepare were not enough to sustain everyone in the camp. Mariana knew they had to get creative. She began experimenting with new ways to stretch the food, finding alternative methods of preparation that would allow them to use even the smallest scraps. Her ingenuity was put to the test as she combined old recipes with new ideas, stretching the limits of what little they had. But as the prisoners' health improved, so did their spirits. They began to form a sense of camaraderie. They shared what little they had and worked together to find ways to make their situation more bearable. Even the most desperate prisoners, those who had long since given up, began to participate. They saw the results of their combined efforts in their regained strength, in their clearer minds, and in the subtle but undeniable sense of unity that was beginning to grow. At the same time, the camp's authorities began to notice the changes. The prisoners were starting to look healthier. Their work output had increased, and whispers of unrest were growing louder. Some of the guards became more vigilant, watching the prisoners more closely, searching for any sign of disobedience or resistance. For the first time, Mariana felt the weight of the danger pressing in on her. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone would betray the secret of what was happening. The very acts of defiance that were giving the prisoners hope could be the same things that would bring about their downfall. One evening, as Mariana sat with a small group of prisoners, reviewing the progress of their food efforts, she overheard a conversation between two guards. They were discussing how the prisoners seemed to be regaining their strength. One of the guards mentioned that the prisoners were starting to work more efficiently and wondered if the camp authorities had increased their rations. The other guard dismissed the idea, but the conversation was enough to alert Mariana to the fact that the authorities were beginning to pay attention. Mariana knew that time was running out. The small, quiet rebellion they had managed to build was fragile, and every day that passed brought them closer to discovery. Yet, despite the looming threat, she remained resolute. She had come too far to turn back now. The prisoners had come to rely on her leadership, and she could not abandon them. In the days that followed, Mariana took even greater precautions. She instructed the prisoners to be more discreet with their activities, to be careful about who they spoke to and what they said. She knew that if they were to survive, they had to stay united and keep their actions hidden. At the same time, she continued to push the boundaries of what they could achieve. She found ways to collect more food, to stretch their supplies further, and to make the meals even more nourishing. It was during this time that a small but important change occurred. The prisoners began to think not only about surviving the day, but about the future. They started to plan beyond the next meal. For the first time, they spoke of escape, of resistance, and of how they could turn the tide in their favor. Mariana, ever cautious, kept these thoughts to a minimum, but she could see the spark in their eyes. They were no longer simply waiting to be saved. They were actively trying to change their fate. Mariana's heart swelled with pride as she saw the shift in the prisoners. They were no longer broken. They were beginning to rebuild themselves. And while the risks of rebellion continued to grow, so did their sense of solidarity. Every day they survived felt like a victory, and with every victory, they took one step closer to freedom. But Mariana knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and the stakes had never been higher. Yet, in that moment, as she looked at the faces of those around her, she knew that together, they had found something that could not be taken away: hope. The camp had become a place of silent defiance, a place where hope and fear coexisted in equal measure. As Mariana's small network of resistance continued to grow, so did the tension within the camp. It was no longer just a matter of survival. It had become about something much bigger. The prisoners were no longer merely enduring their fate. They were fighting to take back control of their lives. Mariana's leadership had transformed them, giving them a sense of purpose they had not had in a long time. But with every act of defiance, the risk of discovery grew. The guards had become more suspicious, and the rumors of unrest began to spread throughout the camp. One morning, the worst fear that Mariana had been dreading for weeks came true. The camp authorities launched a search of the barracks. They went through the prisoners' possessions, turning everything upside down in an effort to find any evidence of rebellion. The guards were ruthless, tearing through clothing, bedding, and personal items with no regard for the prisoners' dignity. Mariana felt a chill run down her spine as she saw the search unfold. She knew that if the authorities discovered what had been happening, it could mean the end for everyone involved. Her heart raced as she looked around, seeing her fellow prisoners tense up, trying to hide their fear. Every face was filled with a mixture of anxiety and determination. They knew that this moment could change everything. Despite the growing fear, Mariana remained calm. She had anticipated that this might happen one day, and she had taken precautions. The most important supplies, the small cooking devices, the bags of food, had already been hidden in secret locations around the camp. She had made sure that any evidence of their activities would be difficult to trace. But even so, the uncertainty of the situation was overwhelming. The search lasted for hours, and the guards seemed to grow more frustrated with every passing minute. They found nothing. There was no trace of the food network, no evidence that the prisoners had been organizing in secret, but the authorities weren't fooled. They could sense something was different. The prisoners were acting strangely, more alert, more energetic. The guards had grown more watchful, knowing that something was afoot. Mariana knew that the authorities were just biding their time. The search might not have yielded any immediate results, but it was only a matter of time before they would take more drastic measures. She also knew that if the prisoners were going to survive, they had to act quickly. The next step in their plan had to be executed before the authorities could launch a full-scale crackdown. In the days that followed, Mariana called a meeting with the leaders of her small network. They huddled in the shadows, whispering urgently about what they needed to do next. The situation was dire. The prisoners had no illusions about what would happen if the authorities discovered their rebellion. They could be sent to punishment cells, or worse. Some of them might even be executed as an example to the others. But despite the risks, Mariana knew they had no other choice. Her plan was simple, but it carried great risk. She knew that they had to make a final push to break free from the camp's control. The prisoners were ready. They had gained strength over the past few weeks, and their unity had grown. Together, they could fight back against the guards and make their escape. It was a long shot, but Mariana believed it was the only chance they had. The alternative was to stay trapped in a system that would slowly suffocate them, both physically and mentally. The night of the escape arrived, and the atmosphere in the camp was tense with anticipation. The prisoners moved quietly, gathering their belongings and preparing for the moment when they would make their move. Mariana coordinated everything with precision, directing the small groups to their designated positions. They had a limited window of time before the guards would change shifts, and they knew they had to act fast. Mariana led the group toward the fence that separated them from the outside world. The guards were stationed along the perimeter, but they had grown complacent, their attention wavering as the night stretched on. It was now or never. With a signal from Mariana, the first group of prisoners began to move. They crawled through the mud and under the barbed wire, using the cover of darkness to conceal their movements. The tension in the air was palpable. Every step they took brought them closer to freedom, but also to the ever-present danger of being caught. The slightest noise, the smallest misstep, could alert the guards, and their entire plan would be shattered. Mariana's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the first group reach the other side of the fence. They were safe for now, but the hardest part was yet to come. As the prisoners continued to make their way out, Mariana kept a watchful eye on the guards. She knew they had only one chance to get through undetected. Minutes felt like hours as they crawled toward freedom. The last group of prisoners was finally approaching the fence when a guard's voice suddenly rang out in the distance. It was a shout. Something was wrong. Mariana's stomach dropped as she realized that they had been spotted. There was no turning back now. The chaos erupted in an instant. Guards began to shout and run toward the fence, their footsteps growing louder as they closed in on the escaping prisoners. The first shots rang out in the night, and Mariana felt the weight of the moment crash down on her. She urged the last group forward, willing them to move faster. They were so close. In the final moments, it was a blur of motion and fear. Mariana pushed the last of the prisoners through the fence, one by one, as the guards closed in. The sounds of gunfire filled the air. and the prisoners scattered into the night. The escape had turned into a desperate, frenzied dash for freedom. Against all odds, they made it. Mariana and the prisoners who had escaped were free from the camp, free from the system that had oppressed them for so long. But even as they fled into the wilderness, they knew that their journey was far from over. The authorities would stop at nothing to recapture them. But for the first time in a long while, Mariana felt a sense of triumph. She had done what no one thought possible. She had led her fellow prisoners to freedom, and in doing so, she had shown them the power of hope, courage, and ingenuity. This was not just a victory for Mariana or for the prisoners. It was a victory for all those who had ever been oppressed, all those who had ever felt powerless in the face of tyranny. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and to the unbreakable will to survive. Mariana had proven that even in the darkest of times, the courage of one person could ignite a flame that would light the way for many others.